Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Crystal Andrews Banks, and I have the pleasure of leading diversity and inclusion for Ulta Beauty. And so excited to have the opportunity to share the stage with my D&I colleagues and supporters. And so I'll ask my fellow panel folks to introduce themselves. So Corliss, you're the first one on my screen.
My name is Corliss Udoema. I'm so happy to be here. It's taken me, I'm a little full because I'm 71 years old and I never thought I would live to be among such a group of people coming to have the conversation. And I'm all about conversation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Regina Lawless, and I do this work every day. So I'm always game to have a discussion, but more importantly, I'm passionate about building more awareness around the ways that unconscious bias, privilege, allyship, how all of those things work, not only outside in the world, but more importantly, how we can practice and uncover those things in the workplace. So I am thrilled to be here today and looking forward to our discussion.
It's awesome to be here. So I am Meredith Morales. I've been doing this work for about 13 years. And so, with that, it's really exciting, kind of similar to Corliss's point, to see, 10 years ago, this was more of a compliance conversation and people didn't know what to do. And it was like, kind of check the box. Did you go to the fair? Yeah, we went to the fair. Did you post the job? Yep, we posted the job. And now to see the shift, right, for people to really want to authentically understand and authentically engage and find ways to knock down systemic barriers is really just truly amazing. So excited to be on this journey and find ways to help others continue to navigate the journey as well.
Hello, everyone. My name is Glenn Newman. I have years of experience in campus recruiting, and diversity programs. So excited and glad to be a part of the conversation today.
Hi, guys. I'm Alexia. I'm rolling into the 4th year of my career, so not nearly as tenured as the other folks here, but within these 4 years, I've seen a lot. So I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I'm thankful for the platform that BDI has given us to talk about this.
So we will go ahead and get started now with our first question. So when you think about the companies that we each work for as an institution, right? And in order to create sustainable change, you have to think about systematically removing bias and barriers. How are you guys approaching diversity training versus investing in the development of your diverse talent?
Thanks so much, Crystal. I love that question. So, diversity training, I'll tell you right now, I have a bias on unconscious bias training because, yes, we all know it exists, but it can often be taken as like well, here's your past, you have some bias. So, it doesn't like land you anywhere. And so we realize that. And then there's also data that shows 86% of companies that had been leveraging unconscious bias training really saw nearly less than a percentage point of improvements in their workforce mobility and strategy and opportunities for diverse professionals. So, I would caution against an over-reliance on training and more of a fundamental belief building, right? So when you're doing your hiring, when you're doing your promoting of managers to run teams, when you're thinking about your succession plans, do these folks believe? You got to start with belief, right? Because I can tell you all day the sky is purple. But if you don't believe me, you won't get behind it. Studies also show that more diverse leaders naturally hire more diverse teams. So our top down is not just belief, but also enabling our existing leaders and our incoming leaders to be truly inclusive and understanding what that means and developing those skills. And as we're supporting them in that journey, we are then matriculating into rolling it into performance reviews. Right? How can you be promoted to the next level of leadership if you don't have a truly inclusive leader, a truly inclusive style and diverse team, right? Or inclusive practices. And so I could go on, but that's one of the ways in which we are leaning into training versus more sustainability.
And that's such a great perspective. And I love that approach, and kind of curious to hear the approach that you're taking, Regina.
Meredith hit the nail on the head. Unconscious bias training is a good start to build awareness and help people understand that they have biases, but it is by no means the end all be all. And so what we're doing is really focusing on behaviors. And so we're trying to look at our talent, or are currently looking at our talent lifecycle, and all of those decision points that are largely driven by our managers. How can we enable them to do the right thing? Because we know that our unconscious bias is going to get in the way. We can't get rid of that, even if we are aware. Studies show just because you're aware that overeating is a problem, that doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden going to, be on a diet every day. So, so awareness does not breed outcomes. So we are looking at how we can build more inclusive interview teams. That's a current initiative that we're doing. So we're making sure that for every requisition, every job that we hire for, we have at least one diverse person or one person from an underrepresented group on that panel. So that way, not only is that a way for candidates to see themselves reflected at the company, but also to have someone else that has a different perspective. That in and of itself has shown to remove some of that bias from those hiring decisions. And then similarly, we're looking at, we've added some new inclusion practices into how we do our talent reviews or calibration around performance. So we've added a role that we call the inclusion advocate that sits in and assists the facilitator to interrupt bias real time. So when someone is saying that, this person coming back from leave, just having a child, maybe they aren't going to be ready or willing to take on an assignment overseas, we're going to push on that inclusion advocate is going to ask, tell me more, what leads you to believe that? So those are just two of the initiatives that we're doing to try to make this real and go and focus on the behaviors rather than just unconscious bias training.
It's so interesting. I was going to chime in because I love what Regina was sharing around having that inclusion advocate. I think it's so important, right? So many of our organizations have these programs where we kind of not put the onus, but where we take the women and underrepresented minorities and we put them through a development program. And we all know that decisions around promotions and bonus and calibration and segmentation, those decisions are made behind closed doors. And oftentimes we aren't in the room when those decisions happen, right? And so I think I wanted to just talk about sponsorship really quickly, right? Because in addition to having that inclusion advocate, it's really important that, marginalized groups, especially women and underrepresented minorities, have sponsors. So, our leaders who say that they're committed, are they sponsoring diverse talent such that when that diverse talent isn't in the room, they're saying, you know what, I worked with Crystal on this project and I think she's ready for the next step. I think the other thing I'll touch on really quickly is feedback. Oftentimes I'll hear managers say, well, I just didn't have any women or underrepresented minorities who are ready. Okay, so do they know that they weren't ready? 2, do they know why they weren't ready? And then 3, are you working with them on a development plan such that the next promotion cycle, they will be ready? And then that's when leaders get a little quiet, right? So I think there's always more work to be done in that space. And I think leaders can really walk the talk by sponsoring and making sure that their teams and managers are giving people the feedback that they really need to develop and grow.
That's the great perspective. And I'm running Alexia, Corliss, anything else that you would want to add?
Yeah, I want to piggyback onto what Glenn just said. And I think a lot of people want to know, what can I do to be a good ally? And it starts with sponsoring anyone in your organization, anyone in your network who is Black or African American. I think the reason that I ended up at Workday and that my career is where it is now is because I had a sponsor who was a woman named Tran Andrada, who looked to me and said, I see potential in her and I want to be a sponsor for her throughout her career. And that's how I ended up where I am. But if it wasn't for someone like her, I don't think that these doors and opportunities would have been there for me. So it definitely takes, I think, an individual within their organization saying, I want to sponsor someone that doesn't look like me. And I'm going to make it my mission to continue to sponsor that person throughout their career.
I didn't know whether I was going to share this, but I think that I will. Many years ago, before all of you were born, that's over 50 years ago, I had a daughter. My best friend had a son, and I was looking for nursery school. And She said, hey, this is the name of the school. Go there. It's a great school. Everything was cool until I got there. And then they told me that they did not accept colored children. So that was my child, and we were the colored people. And the reason I'm making this point is that there's no way my best friend would have sent me someplace that I would be denied access. The point was that because she wasn't a minority, she had no idea. And so that brings about that sensitivity. You know, you can't do what you don't know. And because she had never experienced it, she had no idea. And so we cried, and then, you know, we were able to move on. But I today is still present.
I agree. And thank you for sharing that. One of the things that people were really looking for are those nuggets pertaining to inclusive recruiting or diversity recruiting. So we'd love to move the conversation to that. So I'm sure all of you heard the statement by the Wells Fargo CEO, where he blamed the lack of diversity at the bank on a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from, which we all know is a myth.
Baloney.
Exactly. So for my fellow panelists here, how can companies get real about diversity of recruiting efforts? So Meredith, if we could start with you, would be perfect.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, this is such a great question, particularly because we all focus on recruitment and bringing talent in. But, you know, several of the misses include, are we thinking about what we already look like inside? Right? Like who does your company look like when we visit the website, when we visit the board of directors, who do we see? Right? And so, you know, it's hard for you to attract diverse talent if you're not already nurturing the talent that you have in the door. Because what happens is when you call, if they take your call, right, they may listen, and then they're going to find someone that looks like them and reach out and say, hey, you know, BDI just called me. What's it really like in there? Right? Because there is a trust that needs to be created. This is not just transactional hiring. When you're asking candidates from underrepresented groups to come and join your company, you don't always have, you may have the privilege of not realizing the weight of your ask, particularly if you're going after passive talent. So if there's talent that you see on LinkedIn or in someone's network that looks great and you're like, oh, my company's great, they'd want to work here. Well, that talent, if they've moved up in their company, why would they trust that making a jump over from where they are supported, their company is doubling down on diversity and inclusion? They feel like they belong. Why would they give that up for a higher title and some money? That's not really always the currency that, you know, individuals from underrepresented groups require. And so it's really important to develop allies, and we can talk about how later in the conversation, but to develop active allyship, where people are not just bystanders, but folks from all of the groups can talk about the diversity and the commitment and how that shows up. What's the experience? What's the why? Why is the company doing it? Because everybody else is, you know, and where are you in your journey, right? Is the conversation where you don't talk about it and the person's wondering, okay, well, did you call me because of how you think I identify? Or are you being upfront, right? We're leaning into this. We're not where we are, but here, you know, here's what we're doing, you know, and I'd love for you to be a part of this team. And so there's a lot of different ways to consider that. The other point I want to raise is also, you know, not just your talent brand, right? What's the story on the street? But also, you know, how are you thinking about your engagement tactics throughout the process? Are you pipelining? Or are you waiting just until, you know, the job opens? And then are you trying to mold candidates into, you know, the right fit? So, you know, when we think about what the Wells Fargo CEO said, he's not alone. And I would argue he's right. Here's why. Because he's thinking, I want someone like me. They can have a different skin color, but I want them to look like me. I want them to go to school where I went, talk how I talk, have my background, share my values, my beliefs, right? Everything. And that's not truly a diverse slate, right? That's why it's so hard to find candidates if you're looking for something that is homogenous. And so companies have to get really honest. You know, there's no longer space for you know, cultural fit. It's more about culture add. What are they bringing to the table? that you can leverage to drive your business forward. You can't take your background and expect someone to fit in a perfect box and just look different. That's not true diversity, and that's not inclusive, and it will never work. And the last point I make, I'll promise I can get on a soapbox, but the last point I'll make on this is, don't just over rely on the postings and, working with external, vendors. Build your pipeline over time, build relationships so that when you're ready, right, you can have that conversation, and it's a conversation and not a transaction. And in addition to that, you want to make sure that you're working with external partners. I think too often, all of these great organizations like National Black MBA and Prospanica and, all of these different organizations exist not as recruiting tools, but they need to be part of your toolkit because they help you confirm that your brand is a good one, right? They help candidates believe in your brand. They help candidates understand that this is a safe place, even though your numbers are not where you want them to be. And so be inclusive of how you're building out your talent pipeline and who you're bringing on the journey to tell your story as you all navigate to get to where you want to be.
So that was amazing, Meredith. So thank you for sharing sharing those insights and just thinking about kind of a call to action, tangible things that you can do. In our prep call, Regina, you had some great nuggets that you wanted to share with everyone.
Yeah, I love Meredith for dropping all that knowledge. So thank you. One of the things that I am up against and my team is around the hiring manager's mindset. And you touched on this a couple of times, Meredith. So we're finding that we've set our diversity goals. We want to increase representation. But what we run into when we go to hiring managers, that they already have a predetermined template of what makes a successful candidate. So it's tier 1 school, and a particular background like Meredith talked about. They have to have a particular, pedigree of, companies that they've worked for. So that is going to continue to produce the exact same representation in your organization that you have today. So that we're doing right now, trying to help our leaders understand. And Meredith, you said this culture add. We have been so accustomed to culture fit. Does this person fit my culture? That is a recipe, again, for homogenous organizations. We need people that are going to come and bring their unique self. We need people that don't just come from tier 1 universities. Those schools are great, but I was teaching a class on interviewing bias, and I had one of our tenured engineers say, he loves to find people from some of the, more like state schools outside of like the tier 1, because he's found that not only are those people, they tend to have a different mindset around solving problems. They don't have this kind of rote formula that they've been taught in some of these tier 1 institutions. So I loved that perspective. And that's what we're trying to get our hiring managers to understand. If you have something so prescriptive, you're going to miss out on broad talent and different talent and different perspectives. So that's one of the ways that we've been starting with just training we're taking every manager through our interview bias training and just challenging them on some of the longstanding beliefs that they had, that you can only be successful if you have this particular background or you sound this way or look this way. So that's been proving successful so far, but we'll of course see after we fully roll it out how our organization changes. But
I love that. And it does kind of start with training the hiring managers, because at the end of the day, regardless of how diverse slate you're provided, they're still the ones that have to make the decision. And I see you nodding your head, Glenn, so I'm sure you have something to add to this.
Honestly, I love everything that both Regina and Meredith shared. I think the other another way to think about it is we hear companies talk about building a diverse pipeline of talent, when in essence, I question, are you actually building, or are you just hiring people who already have the skills that you think you need? as opposed to bringing in people who may not today have the skills, knowledge, and experiences that you need, but you're investing in them, right? So that's actually building a pipeline of talent, is when you take people who don't currently have what you think you need or what you need, and you're taking and building a specific program for them to be invested in, right? And so I think that's a different level of investment than, going out and finding the already, ready talent, right? And I think, if you really, if we want to have conversations around like structural inequity and, lack of access and lack of exposure, and how certain people, depending on where you come from and how you grew up, you just didn't have access to the type of education such that you are able to code and know C# and C++ and Python, et cetera, then you'll understand the importance of companies making those investments into that talent, right? Because we know that we aren't all at the same starting point, right? There's not a level playing field, and because there isn't, it's kind of silly for CEOs like Wells Fargo CEO to make those kinds of statements, because if you understand that we're not all, we didn't come from the same place, we didn't start at the same place, then you would understand why there is a perceived lack of talent, especially as it relates to tech talent.
I think of one word, and that's intentional. It's like we do with veterans. We have a number of veterans in our company because we're very intentional. And the bias, what do you look good on paper? To be honest, at 61, that's what happened with me. I started a ramp up of a business because the job that I had ended. And when I looked at myself, I said, okay, who's going to want this brown-faced lady? Okay. So what I decided was, I'm not going through this at this age of my life. I'm not going through all of that. So guess what I did? I started with my $50, and then I grew my company to a multi-million-dollar company because I didn't want to deal with it. So we have to be intentional. If you have a cup of coffee and it spills, you're not going to get water. So what's on the inside? And I can certainly relate to that when the hiring manager is saying, okay, the school, nah, the other things, nah, they're not going to fit, and not giving it a chance to work. Because just because it's different doesn't mean that it's bad. We got to get that message out there. Just because you're different, it doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's negative.
I would also urge a lot of you to sit down and really think about what the word culture fit means. And is that a coded message for someone that reminds you of yourself, right? I know that certain companies, and I'm not knocking them, but Google uses the term Googliness, and they rate when they're interviewing based upon your Googliness. But if you ask someone at Google, what does Googliness mean? They tend to state characteristics that are associated with individuals from a certain race or certain background who have had certain life experiences. So I would urge you all to think about what the word culture fit means when you're interviewing, and to really make that more inclusive. And I think in addition to that, for the sake of interactiveness, can you guys raise your hands if your company has more than 5 Black recruiters that you know of personally, more than 5 Black recruiters? So it's something that I would think about. I would definitely think about that and urge your organizations from a leadership standpoint to begin looking at how many Black recruiters are there, because we often relate to people that we feel, we look at them and we say, that reminds me of my uncle, that reminds me of my cousin, that reminds me of my best friend. So I want to talk to her, I want to engage with her. So when I see often recruiters at engagement fairs or at career fairs, I tend to notice that a majority of them are Caucasian women. And very rarely do they reach out to the African-American male walking by or the Black woman who comes by and inquires about the company. But they're more than likely going to engage with someone that reminds them of their sorority sister or their cousin or their friend. So I would really urge you guys to get your companies to start thinking about what kind of recruiters do we have, because those are the people that are going to be on the front lines speaking to candidates.
Like, how do you get your companies to think differently, to take risk, right? And not do the same things that we've always done or do the cookie cutter things, but how do we be innovative and think outside of the box? So actually the last question I want to ask the panelists is, so When you think about risk taking, like what advice would you have for attendees here to really challenge the status quo and challenge those in leadership to think differently of how they could really optimize diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I want to start by answering that question and saying, I think one of the biggest things that we can do to tackle that is not seeing minorities as a risk decision. Because I will tell you right now that I highly doubt that when individuals hire white males, they see them as a risk, or they assess them as taking a leap of faith. But those individuals are just as likely, if not more, to underperform, to join an organization, and to not reflect the principles of what that organization as a whole is hoping to uphold. So I would hope that we start by seeing African Americans and candidates of different colors and backgrounds, not as risks, but rather as valuable assets, even more valuable assets, because they're building a different perspective in a boardroom. They're having those conversations. They're giving you a thought that you would have never thought of prior. So I think that that is one of the first things that we can do is see your Black candidates, and I'm gonna say Black because it is what it is, as valuable and as even more valuable team members rather than risks.
If I could just jump in on that, I would totally +1 to everything. And I was on a call last night where they were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement in Japan. It was insanely interesting. And they, the guy brought up something really interesting that I think relates to Alexia's point. So we talk a lot about Black Lives Matter, right? And they do. But, if you go back to the 70s and the 60s, it was, I am somebody. And that really gets at the root of what we're trying to say, right? When you have bias in a process, this is actually people seeing consciously or subconsciously, not seeing people of color as people, right? And being worthy and valid and not risk, but actually seeing worthy of having that, being considered for that role. The other thing that I wanted to share is, it's interesting, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, famously said, right, you can disagree, but you need to do it in a way that you bring others along. Diverse leaders hire diverse teams. And so, in tech, there's not a lot of diverse networks, right? Like, how diverse is the network of your CEO? How diverse is your network, right? And so if you don't diversify your network, then we're not going to ever get great at this. Interviewing creates a hierarchy. Interviewers up here, interviewees here. Right? So how do you level that playing field? You bring the peers together, put them in a working situation where they're thinking together as a team, and they're building that relationship over time to continuously work on this challenge. That changes the narrative. And now that risk, that supposed risk goes away, because now, Steve, we know each other because we've been on the same team, right? And in addition to that, we've diversified our networks. So now when I'm looking to fill my job, and your peers, I can say, hey, Steve, who do you know? Right? Because you don't look like me, and likely you have a more diverse network than I do. So now the who do you know, that ask is more diverse with a broader reach and a bigger trust on the candidate side, because that candidate knows you, who would refer, who's driving that referral. So, ultimately, to drive sustainable change, you have to bring people along and ensure that they're not scared to have these conversations and be challenged to move forward in their journey.
And Crystal, I just want to hop in on the risk conversation, because I think that's just such an important topic around how we reframe our Black talent as, not a risk. I would also extend that to leaders, because oftentimes we see that we are not both females, Black, African American, Hispanic, or Latinx are not represented, proportionally in leadership either. And it's because of this frame that we have on what makes a leader. And we tend to align to kind of the white male archetype, because that's the majority of who's leading our organizations. And I can tell you, as a Black woman, I lead very differently. I lead more collaboratively. When I'm in meetings, I am intentional. I am listening. I'm trying to synthesize and pull things together. I am not in your face, doing this and being aggressive and trying to dominate the conversation. But yet I had a leader tell me, you're quiet in meetings. I need you to be bolder. Do you need me to be bolder, which, by the way, he couldn't define, or do you need me to be effective, which I am? And so I think that we need to understand, be clear about what the actual requirements are of the leadership position and realize that different people are going to approach it differently. There are more than one way to lead and be effective. There isn't this one archetype. And I think if we can help leaders to understand that, they'll be more open to leaders that look differently. But if we keep expecting this one way to lead the organization, we see that that's failing time and time again. So we need a different approach. We need to bring in people that have different perspectives and different leadership styles. And the way to do that is to have more inclusion in who's making these decisions. One manager should not be able to crush a person's career. And I see that time and time again. I've been in HR for 15 years, and often it comes down to one manager that says, I'm not sure if this person is ready, because they're looking for someone that looks like them or thinks like them. And so that's what I would encourage you all to look at, how you can broaden those decision points, whether it be hiring, but specific to leadership, getting multiple points of feedback, being clear on the actual requirements for the job and not just style, and then building a pipeline of just a variety of different leaders and perspectives. And you will find that those different leaders, those diverse leaders, are going to bring so much richness, so much tenacity. I know a lot of us have had to go through so many hurdles. I often give an example. I started my master's degree when my son was starting kindergarten, same day. So if you're looking for someone with tenacity and figuring out how to get it done and still working full time and commuting and trying to cook dinner. So, I would encourage you all to look at that value that, women of color, Black men, Hispanic men, there's such a richness that we bring that, from our different lived experience.
I love that. And you're clearly a superwoman. So thank you for sharing that. Glenn, Corliss, anything else that you guys would add?
If we took a snapshot of companies, where you have like large leadership, I have a very small company, but you have large leadership group or your upper management group, what would that picture look like? Could they send that in, after this is over, and just to see what it looks like? What color? What's the color scheme going to be? Would there be some diversity or not? What do you think? You see, because I was doing business with a company, and one day I went to their website and I saw a sea of people, I don't know, like 100 people. And I didn't see anyone that looked like me. And I'm like, wow. And I happen to know that area, and there's a lot of folks that look like me, but yet the picture was totally, totally different.
I was going to say something different in terms of the advice, but based on what you just said, Corliss, I think what I will say is, if you are a decision maker or you have a seat at the table and you're thinking about vendors or partners externally, make it a requirement that there be some sort of diversity, right? Like have it in writing, get it in writing in the contract, that the team will be diverse, or that the company has certain commitments to diversity and inclusion, right? I think that's a really great way to help people understand that this is important, and that if you don't do anything as relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it will literally impact your business and your ability to get contracts and to get new accounts or to keep existing accounts. So I think that would be the advice that I give to you all.
Yeah, Glenn, I love you. And guess what happened? When they came to do the next round of business, it was bye. So yeah, so that was my thing. And I did bring that up.
No, I love that. And so because I'm the moderator, I get to say the last word for this question. So the one thing I would just advise everyone to do is look, these things are like 400 plus years in the making, right? So you have to meet your organization where they are versus where you want them to be. And even one small step could create that ripple effect for greater change. So I know you're walking away hopefully with a lot of best practices, insights, and nuggets that you'll obviously have to customize given your situation and organization, but just keep that in mind, right? It just takes like one small act to start to create change.